Okay. So I'm going to switch to English. Welcome everybody. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Carolina Cambre is associate professor at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. Her work explores vernacular visual expression, asking the questions like how do people produce and direct the visual space? How is the image doing? What are the social and cultural workings of images? And so forth. She has ongoing projects on visual processes of legitimation, representation of online sharing, the visual politics of identity, and polymedia literacies. She's the author of The Semiotics of Che Guevara, Affective Gateways from 2015, and co-author of Mediated Interfaces, The Body on Social Media from 2020, and The Future Face Toward a Sociology of Selfies, which is forthcoming, right? It's coming very soon. Carolina's artistic work in the mediums of encaustic photography and multimedia college has been featured as cover art for a number of magazines and books, as well as juried competitions. And without further ado, I pass it over to Carolina.
Gracias. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I am very grateful to CLACS and Dr. Ignacio Aguiló for inviting me. I'm going to be using the pronoun we throughout the talk as a marker of the fact that this was a team effort. And I want to also acknowledge that I had incredible support from the members of the community, in particular, Julio Colantini, who also shared many photographs, and a great student and colleague who worked with me and was core to this experiment, Claudia Rica. I've not really spoken about this project, but I'm really interested to find out what people think about it. And it was very much a methodological experiment because of the kinds of constraints that I faced in Buenos Aires with respect to the field site, in this case, the Isauro Arancibia. There are 5 parts to this talk. I'll begin by briefly introducing the school and the event that we chose as a critical incident to focus on for our photo elicitation / curation interviews, where we experimented with participant curation. Then I'll describe briefly some of the aspects of the study and think through with you some of the interesting encounters that arose through this process. School number 70, Isauro Arancibia, is an unofficial Argentine self-managed school for students of all ages who live in precarious situations, whether due to housing or schooling conditions, homelessness, economic hardship, or cultural violence. In 2014, the Isauro made national news by defeating Buenos Aires' municipal plan to demolish the school to make way for a bus route. Demonstrations and open-air classes were held outside the doors of the Ministry of Education to denounce systematic hollowing out of the school's capacity to function, and more specifically, the lack of electricity, the lack of water, the broken walls, and the lack of heat. Despite the intensity of public debate and the pushback, the city continued to press, and between 2017 and 18, they demolished part of the school. And classes were moved to a building a few blocks away, and the protests still continued, pushing, and finally, the city promised to extend the back end of the school. They wiped out the front of the school to put a bus line through, and then they extended the back end of the school and allowed classes to return to the renovated building. To explore these kind of shifting and temporary, but always renewing conditions outside of formal organizations, we as researchers recognized that methodological complexity was needed. These nomadic relations and their affectivity embody and express the movement of the social imaginary and its continuous processes of becoming. Much of the collective action taking and conceptual framing at the school appears to be organized through these processes. So what we do in the study is we return to an event held in September 2016 to assert its existence after winning a court case against the government. To understand how school community members saw what teachers and students were communicating publicly and the impact it had, we ask how visually performative gestures act as conceptual frameworks, enabling action-taking and embodiment of participatory collective decision-making processes. So what we did was innovate on photo elicitation methods because we found that there were transformative effects on a subjective level for individuals that we're going to describe as molecular insurrections, following Felix Guattari's theorization of molecular revolutions. But because he defines revolution as something that creates a permanent change, and we recognize that these changes in people are not always permanent, we just prefer to say that it's a molecular insurrection rather than a molecular revolution. A bit of background on the school. The school is in Buenos Aires, a city between 2 and 3 million inhabitants, but with a greater metropolitan area with over 13 million inhabitants and the second largest city in South America. Around and inside the city center are large urban slums known as villas miseria, or villages of misery, casas tomadas, taken houses or squats, and viviendas precarias, precarious housing, where people live without sanitation systems or other services. Living in these kinds of conditions marginalizes families through macro policy economic decisions taken by many of the city's administrations since 1975. And the Isauro Arancibia Educational Center, henceforth, I'll just call it Isauro, founded in 1998, was the lifelong work of director Susana Reyes, a popular educator who also survived one of the clandestine detention centers called Vesubio during the dictatorship in Argentina. So she has really built this school on her own. And since then, it has grown to around 400 students and over 100 educators and administrative workers. It includes a baby and infant center and primary and secondary school for all ages. And many women who are in conditions of homelessness attend with toddlers who are cared for at the Children's Center. The Isauro sees the kids on the street or who are self-identified as pibes de la calle as those whose social ties have largely been severed and who require support to establish a network of collective practices which might influence their meaning-making processes so they can choose to plan their lives differently, starting at the school. Members of the school, through collective organization and work of the community, attribute their success over the municipality just in order to be able to exist to the visibility of their cause. So the visual is actually a very important factor, not just for the community and the school, but also for all their processes. It's important to stress, though, that despite the success of the program and the school in existing, it's not really considered by the city a formal school and has no legal standing, even though it's listed on municipal web pages. So our initial focus was to understand the ways in which the members of this school community undertook processes of decision-making. And we found that they concurrently took decisions about school daily matters, public education policy, and students' precarious life conditions, largely through a meeting that's held every Friday called an asamblea, where everyone comes together and discusses the situation. All kinds of people work at the schools: teachers, artists, psychologists, social workers, volunteers from NGOs. They all refer to themselves as workers, and they self-organize using different configurations. Throughout the process, we noted that the visual played a crucial role in 3 aspects. As part of a broader pedagogical framework, as the production of actions, acciones, public actions to defend the school's ethos and approach, and finally, to show how community members communicated their educational and socio-political perspectives to a broader public. So visuality was a key role as well in the subjectively transformative experience of participants themselves. And in order to explore this, what we did was return to the pivotal event of the re-inauguration of the school. The event was documented extensively, which allowed us to create a selection of 105 photographs from a much larger corpus. And using these, we interviewed 9 school community members who had attended the event. Our analysis challenges the notion of seeing, of what is and what is not there to be seen, and what kinds of practices impact subjective transformations through visualization. While the photographs relate to this particular event in a specific location, we found that the location and event expand in the eyes of interviewees and become affectively charged, consequently inscribing and marking their subjectivities. In some ways, the memories triggered through photo elicitation become sightless and may also provoke questions about sightlessness, which prompt further questions about it. What is behind the scene, the unseen, and the seen? Who claims to see what, why, where, and how do people construct visual arguments while seeing? We decided to use imagistic mapping to activate participant memories of and responses to photos of visual interventions organized at the school by its students, staff, teachers, and volunteers, both from the community and social justice groups. And through this, try to catalyze a paradigm shift in scholarly understandings of visually informed social interactions and processes. So what we hope with this project is to contribute to debates on visual and mediation and analysis that consider complex as well as unorthodox ways of reconsidering approaches to policy development. And you can see here that at the event involved activities for children, signs, art activities that were collaborative, food, of course, everyone had to be fed, and tables for different groups to be represented. Our emphasis on lived experience situates this work. And because experience happens narratively, according to Connolly and Clendenin, we use narratives to help construct understandings of social and political activism in precarious communities that are always in flux because they are spaces of tension, always under threat of social and political violence. Participant stories as well are firmly embedded in and respond to pivotal societal issues across time and space. So participant-led narratives provide a space for remarkable memories and lived experiences, suggesting that how they see their role within communities like the Isauro, beset by conflict, is really part of constructing a reality for them. So narrative inquiry prioritizes autobiographical experiences between theory and the stories of life. As an inductive process, this positioning emerges and evolves during the research and requires researchers maintain a position that's kind of agnostic of not knowing so that they can remain open and listen deeply to the how, when, and why participants attach importance to their stories. While the visual context of this research pushed both participants and researchers to communicate in non-traditional modes, we also had an environment for diverse forms of knowledge and understanding that pre-existed our innovation on photo elicitation, which I'm going to call visual elicitation. So we found that established forms of exploring stories was radically insufficient for what we wanted to do. So even though we began with an idea of visual narrative inquiry, where photographs were a form of field text, we noticed that the ways emotions ruptured the storytelling could not be ignored. Each one of our visual elicitation interviews, without fail, featured affectively charged moments where participants' narratives became unstable and were interrupted as powerful emotions took hold in the face of memories and realizations evoked in this process. So while situating the project or the study within narrative studies broadly, the fact that we were using visual methods opened up possibilities and allowed what we're going to talk about as a molecular dimension to come to the fore. The molecular for Guattari and Rolnick has to do with mutations in the conscious and unconscious subjectivity of individuals and social groups that take place within discourse, and even more in people's gestures and attitudes. Once we saw that this kind of molecular wave was in play, we shifted our analysis to foreground affect and aesthetics in recognition that participants were signaling theoretically and pragmatically the dynamics behind the forces of resistance and creation being activated and joined to construct new outlines of reality. I'm not reading everything that's on the text, but it's just there to support sort of some of the things I'm saying now. It's interesting because images are not subject to the confines of written or formal verbal communication. So they allow for very complex ideas to be presented with greater ease than the spoken or written form of communication. Prosser tells us that images are by their nature ambiguous and do not in themselves convey meanings, which are supplied serendipitously by those who perceive them. As such, we're operating here with a theoretical understanding of images that contemplates them as interfaces by intentionally engaging thinking by and on as well as through the image. In many ways, pictures provide insights into the practices through which people construct themselves as social beings within specific locales and enable us to link personal life worlds to wider societal contexts. When discussing photographs, people can iterate links among material circumstances, social positioning, and personal experience. And we found this a particularly rich area of reflection. So this collection, this corpus of images documented each moment of the school tour given by students and teachers, the assembly and the pre-assembly before the event, and all the spaces from the infant toddler nursery, hairdressing studio, bicycle fixing workshop, circus room, sewing room, kitchen classroom, were all represented in that collection, and every moment from the beginning to the end of the event. Each image brought memories, commentaries, and precise choices were made about which to include in the selection allotted to each participant. Each photo had a number on the back. Participants chose 10 that they would then talk about. Some of them took a very long time to decide, and others asked if they could choose more than 10 pictures. And at the end of the process, they were offered opportunities to swap some photos, but very few of them changed them. Then they arranged the photos according to any criteria they wished. So this was the element of curation through which people were thinking by manipulating the images. And then we proceeded with an interview, and it allowed them to open into narrative moments around the event, why they had attended, what else the photos made them think of. The interpretation of an image is grounded in the exercise of reconstructing the experiences of creating and perceiving it, without treating sets of relations between its symbols and their potential meanings as closed systems. Visual narrative inquiry takes the process of doing research into lived social spaces and examines the various ways in which individuals engage social spaces in their community by integrating elements of visual data collection as well as the visual representation of data. Extending these ideas behind what people call visual narrative inquiry, when choosing images from the large table, the participants themselves extended the investigation, became markers of photographs, and then interpreters of how the study might be directed. In our study, each individual developed their own process, necessitating intrinsic criteria for the selections. For example, one person commented, this criterion is like long, but well, it's a bit of a criterion and a kind of grouping of the images based on sensations, it seems to me. The exposure to the multitude of images on the table and the action of selection created a thought process whereby individuals would recall, for example, being in a place, but not that moment. The corpus provided a register that permitted them to add a temporal and spatial dimension to images already in their memories and consequently build a wider understanding beyond what they had previously framed by living through it. The experience is similar to seeing a view through a window and then seeing pictures of what the building looks like from the outside. It reconfigures the mental image for the participant. Because we didn't provide any guides or instructions for choosing images, the process supported independent analytical image decision-making. Each person thought about what to highlight, what to comment on, and reflected back to the day from other angles and perspectives, even sometimes seeing themselves in one or another image and rethinking that moment. So, whether in their description of the isauro or the activities of the day or during the association participants established between the photos and some personal experience, an event occurred during each interview that we call a rupture, an emotional crack in the story, evoking some kind of reflection so that people needed to pause in their speaking. These moments, we posit, were made more possible because we gave a lot of time to the selection process, and people were able to reflect on how they inhabited a social space, in particular, using both images and memory. For Guattari, when individuals begin to question dominant modes of subjectivation, those produced by a capitalist system, and they begin to observe how they reproduce or resist those modes, it initiates a validation of molecular social practices. Guattari calls these molecular revolutions. We prefer to see them as insurrections because the practice of a micropolitics cannot ensure that these molecular shifts will avoid systems that co-opt them, systems of neutralization, or processes of implosion or self-destruction. In a situation as trying and as soul-wrenching as that of the isauro, it's challenging for community members to endure, and the turnover is high. At the same time, the excerpts that we collected and the stories show that there is something, a threshold beyond meaning, a kind of asignifying threshold, a relation of apprehension, which is of the order of affect, of the order of silent interrogation, that catalyzes ideas like, let's sew together donated sweaters to make a giant hug around the school, which would indeed reach the level of molecular revolution that Guattari describes. It isn't a slogan or a program or something that I feel or I live in meetings in institutions. Thus, the stories that we collect do not do justice to the extended thinking and story making in participants' processes. We had to cut them, we had to shrink them, we had to confine them to the academic representation space. But we still note that while each participant used their charged moment of rupture differently, they all demonstrated a willingness to allow themselves to be captured by a sensibility for the molecular, a sensibility for destabilization and the creation of forms of sociability and subjectivity, which is just as, yes, yet differentially essential. Who gets to frame the issue of homelessness? Studies show how ubiquitous news media representations of homeless people frame specific public expectations of deviance, mental illness, laziness, and violence. The spatial regulation of homeless people's lives conveys a perspective on the relational nature of homelessness. Just like Razak's racialized populations, people on the street often appear as shadows, rendered transparent, merely part of the natural environment, to be cleared from the landscape, urban and rural, like debris. Or as the director of the isauro noted in an interview, people on the street are not thought of as subjects with rights, human beings. not cachivaches. Studies of people in conditions of homelessness have been accused of adopting an innocent ethnography serving only to perpetuate assumptions of the homeless as other. These criticisms of naive realism are also leveled at the documentary traditions in poverty research. Isauro community members engaged a different mode of expression, opening up other potentialities, and clearly something that changes the modes of collective subjectification. For Guattari, the possibility of creating or developing modes of subjectification, which he calls processes of singularization, as a way of rejecting all these modes of pre-established encoding, all these modes of manipulation with remote control, rejecting them in order to construct sensibility, relation with the other, modes of production and creativity that produce singularities. These modes merge when an existential singularization coincides with, quote, a desire, a taste for living, a will to construct the world in which we find ourselves, and the establishment of devices to change types of society and types of values that are not ours. The choices of photo that were gratifying, moving, and pleasurable, as well as those that delved into darkness, layers of political strategy, and the deeply humanizing impacts of what might seem to be simple things like reading and writing, illustrate modes of subjectification that exist on different bases than those on which dominant capitalistic culture is established. Additionally, they show individuals finding their own paths of specification. A molecular revolution occurs together on the infrapersonal level, the way in which one lives in relation with society, and the presence of the relations between political forces, the microscopic, but also social levels, where notions of desire awaken and people say, that's it, stop, we won't take it anymore. These were palpable during our interviews. This Argentine-based research can be mobilized to focus on relationships between marginalized populations, acknowledging the voices of those who are often identified as subaltern and those benefiting from hegemonic power imbalances within society. We carefully documented our approach, which was suggestive of barriers to increased consciousness about local values, cultures, leadership, and knowledge systems, and the knowledge needed to build enhanced capacity by, with, and for communities to engage in and benefit from research. Additionally, we highlight and appreciate the deep complexities associated with using mediated texts and images. We found that by focusing on the affective and aesthetic levels, rather than atomistically picking apart quotes, permitted a new context while theorizing understandings of visual textual artifacts, how they circulate within a cultural context, and mobilize molecular insurrections that open pathways for other subjective realities to come into being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. That was really fascinating. Now we have time for questions, and I'm going to abuse my privilege as chair to kick off. But before that, just an interesting fact. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the killing of Isaura Aranciaba, who was murdered by the dictatorship on the 24th of March 1976. So it's an interesting kind of coincidence that we have in the talk today.
It's a historic day. It's a historic day.
Indeed. I want to ask you about, usually in our everyday experience, our photos tend to be nowadays almost almost completely digital, right? Except people who are photographers, etc. And I think this is particularly so for very young people who presumably didn't live through the time in which photographs were kind of printed, etc. But here the photos were printed. So my question is like, how the material and tactile dimension of these print photos, how the fact that they were manipulated, they were shared, they were passed on, influence this affective engagement with these experiences of molecular insurrection that you're talking about?
Well, I think what it did was create a particular kind of space through materiality, where people could just feel comfortable that they weren't involved in a digital or computer atmosphere. I mean, these are community workers and community volunteers. A lot of what they work with is materiality. They're not always in the digital space. And what it allowed was to, when you display something on a screen, it kind of sequences it for you and arranges it for you. But on the table, the arrangement was random. People could move through it differently. So I think materiality was really important in creating a space where there was a kind of freedom for the curation. And they could move back and forth around it and create associations between things that we could not imagine if we were to sequence something digitally for them to go through, right? So it helped us have an idea of non-sequence. They were numbered on the back so that we could track them, but they were not arranged on the table, and they would also move around.
Thanks. If you have if any of you has a question, oh, Pete, you have a question.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I enjoyed the whole methodology of it, of getting people to curate photos, because I mean in anthropology, especially visual anthropology, it's quite common to get give people cameras and get them to take photos, and obviously that's even easier these days when people have mobile phones which they can use. So in the old days people would distribute these throwaway cameras and so forth, and people would often take pictures of their dogs and cats and stuff like this. And anyway, it's interesting to instead to use the curation of images as a way to elicit reactions and thoughts and so on. But I was interested in a couple of things. First of all, the idea about the kind of molecular insurrection as a way in which new subjectivities can be generated or ruptures can be created that, I think what the phrase was in your quote, prevent the return to old structures or something like that. And I wondered if you could just say a bit more about, how could you be sure, how did you know that the kinds of things that people were expressing weren't returning to old structures or wouldn't return to old structures when they left that particular context of the curation and discussion of those images. And the second thing was that I was struck by how, at least in your presentation, the PowerPoint or the PDF you were showing us, how dependent you were on what people said about interviews, where people were talking about how they felt or how they reacted to a certain visual image, which I suppose is kind of inevitable. I mean, what other data are you going to have that you can reproduce in that way? But I just wondered if you had some reflections about a sort of somehow a contradiction between the use of images and the use of curation and the idea that you can kind of get underneath the level of discourse and conscious thought and so on through that practice, and then your need to always depend on what people say about that experience in order to convey that to an audience such as ourselves.
Yeah, okay, I'll thank you for that question. That's very provocative. There are a number of things. I'll begin with the second question in terms of the curation. The curation process of arranging was a memory exercise as well. So they didn't just talk about the images. They told stories that they evoked and stories of the people that were there and how they felt at the time. And what it enabled was a kind of synthesis of understanding in retrospect, looking at it, putting it together, realizing the importance of what they had lived, the impact of it, and the impact on other people. So what it permitted was an articulation of the molecular insurrection that had taken place inside that person. And I think that in being able to articulate it and manifest it, it gives it another dimension. It's more material because they've created language around it and it's become a thing. And so, you know, I don't think there's any guarantee that there's a permanent change. But what we found was that in the reflection and looking at the images, a lot of times people use photo elicitation as a distancing technique so people can talk about difficult knowledge. But in this case, it was the opposite. They immersed themselves into the world that they were looking at and had lived through. So they immersed themselves as implicated subjects in that world. And because they were implicated and immersed in that world, they engaged in that kind of micro politics in their thinking, where they began to question, and they probably had already questioned, notions of what's an individual, what's the power of an individual, what does being an individual mean vis-a-vis the community. And they were able to be very radical in their expression of this. And of course, this is something that, you know, it's not a surprise in Argentina because people really do think about these things a lot, especially because there's such a high level of organization on the street and people do have these kinds of discussions. But these were people who were workers and volunteers and who were busy all day long, either fixing bikes or, you know, holding the hands of children. So the space to think and discuss and reflect, I think, provided a catalyst. I wouldn't say it created a molecular insurrection. A person themselves is involved in that, but it was like a catalyst in terms of a space for something to happen. And then the next step would just to be following up with people on what has happened since. But, you know, the political situation in Argentina is so volatile that a lot of these people, I mean, including myself, were kicked out of the school because of political suspicions of being tied to the right wing and all kinds of things. So it's very fraught. There's a lot of suspicion and anxiety, and, you know, I mean, as an Argentine, I was born suspicious, I always say, you know, but but this is part of the dynamic. And so, you know, giving people cameras, I mean, I probably would have never seen any camera, or maybe saw 3 cameras again, or maybe 2 photos. Like, I mean, it was better to like find a neutral space and do the invitations and try to have people come and just spend some time. So that's kind of how it worked.
Avezami?
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And I was wondering if you can tell us a bit more about the relations between the question of and the limits of the politics of framing, which is inevitable in visuality, and the dimensions of the affective threshold that are present in this case as potentials for what you call the destabilization of the status quo. Via creative envisioning and imagination. In other words, is it a potential, or is there a potential hindering by establishing limits through visuality and framing, and or doesn't have to be binary necessarily? Does it allow to create other forms of envisioning and also thinking in the limits between what is happening inside the dynamics within the production of the images and the relations within the images, and what is happening outside, meaning between the anthropologists or researchers and the communities that are working with these images and with the anthropologists and researchers. Thank you.
Yeah, those are really great questions. Thank you. I think, you know, the physical framing that happens every time a photograph is taken delimits what is seen there. But because this was, what we had done was talk about a critical incident around this event being a critical incident in the history of the school, and all these people had been there. And there were multiple images of the same space with different things happening. They went beyond the frame on their own. So they discussed things that were not in the images. They discussed people they had seen before going to that staircase, or the person who was reading that book and who taught them to read that book. So the frame was not solid. It was like a dotted line through which they could permeate. That's why we understand images here as interfaces that people can go through. And that's what was happening here. So that's the piece about framing. And you asked also about the affective thresholds.
Yes, and the thresholds and the limits and the porosity or not between what was happening inside the dynamics and, let's say, like in a wider level, in the power dynamics with between the researchers and the participants in the research.
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of the relationship between the researchers and the participants, these discussions were held post-event, a couple of years after the event. So it was really, there was that distance, and the people speaking about the event were positioned as the experts who curated the photos and discussed what was happening there. And so the researcher's role was just to say, you know, what do you remember, and why did you pick these photos? Very open-ended, really not setting any terms of engagement. The terms of engagement with the visuals was 100% on the basis of of what participants wanted to discuss. And so it was just a listening exercise and a recording exercise with a follow-up, depending on if people wanted to or not. And in terms of the affective threshold, the thing about an image is that it's not deterministic. It's not like, if you follow Flusser's work, you know, writing invokes a particular consciousness, a historical consciousness, because you have to follow the line from the beginning to the end in a sentence to get what it is saying. So you have to go across time and space, but an image is a surface. And so for Flusser, evokes an imaginative consciousness. Your eye moves around it the way it wishes to, and it can dart between many images, and it can land on one image. And so there was a lot of decision-making power in the hands of participants. I don't know if that goes to what you were asking about.
Yes, if you allow me just 2 seconds to further a little bit in this question. When I was asking about the power relations and the question of framing, precisely it had to do with that. Who is establishing the terms of the grammars or the conversation and the coding that would be valid to be allowed as something that can be communicable about ways of seeing as ways of envisioning the world. I see that maybe you are using social justice centered methods as putting the people at the center and as the experts, which is fabulous. But I still have questions about what happens with the power relations on who is. Us as researchers many times are deciding the framing, the general framing of the situations. And my question is, what are the limits, the potentials, and the possibilities or not of those dynamics within the work with images and these kind of communities? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and there's a lot of ethical responsibility on the part of the researcher that has to be considered. But our approach is we like to frame it as an anti-oppressive and trauma-sensitive approach. So there weren't any pictures of, you know, a lot of students at this school have been killed or beaten up or taken in by police. So we were careful not to include certain kinds of images that would evoke such pain that it would be manipulative on our part. Rather, because we were interested in the question of community and the question of organizing at the school, that's what the images focused on. And the photos were taken by many people, including some of the participants. Some of their own photos were there. So there is a real sort of implicatedness of the researcher with the participant in sort of the process. But in terms of representing the research, we didn't decide to define or frame what was important about the public actions in the school. We only reflect the importance that participants themselves saw in that. And so we didn't do any kind of coding of transcripts at all. What we did was include longer excerpts based on these affective thresholds. So when people had these moments of rupture, which were very surprising to us. I mean, we didn't really have any expectations. We didn't even know if this method was going to work. So, or if anything was going to come of it. So we just said, oh, well, let's just see what happens. Let's talk about the photos. And we were quite surprised in the end that without fail, every single person had a moment of rupture and affective intensity where they would immediately respond, describing their emotion, and then talk about important things. Like the fact that, you know, they see the sweaters hanging around the school, but they're not seeing the sweaters tied in a hug around the school. They're seeing the bodies of the children that should be there, that could be inhabiting them. So they're seeing beyond the image to the possibility. And there is a very acute and sophisticated awareness and analysis on the part of the participants about that. So we didn't really change anything they said. We included as many big blocks as we could in sort of discussing it. And then talked about this micropolitics of molecular transformation that is really, that everybody showed really by questioning the notion of an individual as approved by the state, what it means to count as a human being in this whole situation, which was part of this process of subjectivation. Does that help at all?
Sí, muchísimas gracias.
De nada.
James?
Yeah, sorry, having arrived like 20 minutes late, I'm going to jump in with a question anyway, which you probably answered already. I guess my question was, I was just thinking about, so only having heard the last 20 minutes or so, why the word insurrection exactly? Because I mean, again, from what you were saying, I sort of pick up on the micro elements of it, right? The micro political, the molecular. But the only reason I asked is because, you know, if you take sort of like, say, Emily Apter's, you know, reading of Unexceptional Politics, you don't necessarily have to be at the level of a sort of violence that comes with insurrection for something to be hugely transformative, which was another phrase that you just used literally a couple of minutes ago, right? Molecular transformation. So I was just wondering why, I don't know if this is someone else's term or yours, but why you went with the word insurrection.
Thank you. Yeah, I probably wasn't very clear about that. We're drawing on the work that Felix Guattari did with Sueli Rolnick in Brazil. And so there's a book by Rolnick where she put together lots of stories, letters, talks that Guattari gave while he was in Brazil, including radio interviews with a group of people that were part of the anti-psychiatry movement there. And what they talk about are molecular revolutions. And the molecular revolutions are, for Guattari, when individuals begin to question dominant modes of subjectivation, those produced by a capitalist system. And they themselves begin to observe how they reproduce or resist these modes. And so by doing that, the individual begins to validate their own molecular social practices. But the reason that he defines this molecular revolution as a repetition that changes something, a repetition that brings about something irreversible. And in my own thinking, I think that the practice of micropolitics cannot ensure that these molecular shifts are irreversible because of the power of systems that co-opt them or neutralize them or destroy them. So I prefer to use a term of insurrection because there is that realization, but life is so hard, you know, that it's hard to hold on to something like that and not be completely crushed in the end by the system. I mean, in these kinds of communities, you really do see a lot of people who have given up and are crushed. Just as many people who are hoping and working for change, there are many people who just can't anymore, you know? So that's why insurrection is kind of a bit more modest than a revolution. That's the thinking behind it.
It still sounds like a call to arms, though. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right?
Yeah, sure. I think it is. You know, I think it is the idea to let's sew sweaters together to put a hug around the school. Like, this is a communal moment that manifests visually, physically, tactilely, and then all the donated sweaters are given to kids at the school. And so it's a thing of like, oh, we can do something. And it means something. And we are representing ourselves to the outside world, to whoever goes by that school, to the community, drivers driving by, you know, because it's by an underpass for a highway. So that creates a sort of individual consciousness of being someone, hopefully.
Alisa?
Hi, thank you so much. I love communal moments and sweaters. I have a question that I think sort of builds on some of the other questions that have been asked and is also rooted just in not knowing, like, actually there could be a whole body of literature I'm not familiar with, but I was really interested in the way you talked about affect as kind of rupture that then causes reflection and pause in the narrative. And I was just wondering what motivated that, because I guess I'm thinking of, in kind of anthropology and religious studies, of rupture in a very particular way, whereas I'm thinking that those moments of affect are a continuity of the narrative, right? So I was just wondering if there's maybe something I misunderstood or something you could speak a little bit more about, because I guess from your talk, I was experiencing that as just as not a rupture, rather, just a different kind of way of being with the narrative. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
Absolutely. That's such a great observation and question and thought. And I mean, there's no right and wrong here, right? Because if you have a sort of Foucauldian genealogical approach, you attend to continuities, discontinuities, and ruptures all in the same plane of the narrative. When we started thinking about the affect, it was as a rupture, it was because the story stopped and then changed. So it could still be all one and the same thing, but we've shifted levels. And so I'm using the idea of rupture to signify a kind of a quantum movement. If you want to understand it that way, there's a movement, there's a shift of levels, there's a jump without any link. So if you think of it molecularly, you could say it's a quantum shift where emotion or affect is actually a kind of intelligence that permits them to delve into particular thoughts. And I guess that's how we were seeing it. And I wouldn't dispute what you say. I would even say, of course, it's the same story in a lot of ways, but the way we saw that shift, what people then after those moments, people are like, this is something I want to say, it just crystallized suddenly something for them. So it just marks a shift in a way.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank again Carolina for her fascinating talk, particularly pertinent because now there is a lot of talking about molecular revolutions with regards to what happened in Colombia and Chile. So I think it's interesting that you are bringing this other concept of insurrection, molecular insurrection, to keep on thinking about these different forms of resistance. And thanks everybody for coming. And we'll see everybody after the Easter break with our next event, which can you remember, Pete? I think it's a film, right? Yeah, we will send an email around to everybody in the CLACS mailing list. So Carolina, thank you very much, and see you soon, hopefully.
Thank you. Stay safe, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Keep in touch.